So today we're talking about carbohydrates, okay? And we're continuing on our notes, the part one of our notes for organic chemistry. With carbohydrates, let's do a little background information, kind of remind ourselves of what we already know about carbs. So carbs are going to be made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And carbohydrates are going to have a very specific formula in which we can figure out how many of each of those they have. Almost always, they are going to have a 1:2:1 ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. Another way to write this is as a little formula, CHO to the nth power, okay, where N equals the number of carbs, or carbons, I'm sorry. Okay, so really what a carbohydrate is a chain of carbons, carbon atoms, that are hydrated or almost usually saturated with those hydrogen atoms. Looking in this picture here, you can see the linear form and ring form of the same molecule. Okay, usually, and this is actually a glucose molecule, okay, so a specific type of carbohydrate. Usually, it's actually going to be found in a ring form in an aqueous solution, okay? And so here's another example of that picture here, that abbreviated ring structure. So this basically is a little cleaned up version of this. And notice that it does have these little OH groups on the side. For naming, if we look at this picture right here, we have what's known as a monosaccharide, and we're really going to focus on this word, saccharide. Saccharide means sugar. Okay? So these are generally types of sugars that we're looking at. The main job of a carbohydrate, and the main job of glucose, one of the most important carbohydrates for us, is it stores energy. So energy storage. Okay? And that would be our glucose molecule, which, remember, just a little reminder for us, the chemical formula for glucose is C6H12O6. It can also have other jobs like this ribose structure. This should look familiar to you from looking at RNA, okay, ribonucleic acid. And it actually has 5-carbon chain, or 5-carbon ring with the hydrogens around it. For carbohydrates, we want to look a little specifically at the different types of carbohydrates and mention some examples and names of those.
Isaac Stewart, please come to the front office. Isaac Stewart. Vedad Masanovic, please come to the front office. Vedad Masanovic.
Mono, that prefix means one, or a single, okay? So a single carbohydrate, our most basic example, again, is going to be glucose. Okay. Normally, these carbohydrates are used for energy, and that's because that the bond between C and H is contains a lot of energy. So energy when broken, or energy released, I'm sorry. When broken. Okay. Another example would be fructose and galactose. Those are all examples of monosaccharides that can actually be broken down or absorbed into our system in the small intestine. So something to keep in mind there, that sugars don't get into our bodies, don't really get into our bodies in a way that we can use them until they get to that small intestine. But continue on, disaccharide, di means 2, okay? So 2 glucose monomers joining together.
June Choi, please come to the front office. June Choi, please come to the front office.
Examples of this would be sucrose and lactose. Okay? And here's an example of that. In between them, there's actually actually going to be what's called a glycosidic linkage. And we'll talk a little more about that linkage when we get down here. But for the last one, polysaccharides, poly of course means many, okay? Many of those monomers joining together to form this bigger carbohydrate. So this is really a very quick overview of our carbohydrates. And when we're looking at polysaccharides, we have a little more to get into, a little more depth to get into with our polysaccharides. Remember, that's many of those glucose monomers being joined together. The functions of these polysaccharides, there's two functions, one for energy and two for structure. Starch and glycogen are both compounds of carbohydrates that can be used for energy. And so this is actually how they can be stored, how those extra or excess carbs can be stored. So starch is the way that plants store extra carbon, or extra carbohydrates, excuse me. And then glycogen, if you remember, is the way in which animals store extra carbohydrates or extra glucose molecules. And so in here we just have a simple little example of that starch molecule. Also, carbohydrates can be used for structure. And so cellulose are found in plants. It's a type of carbohydrate that actually helps make the cell wall in plants. And you're going to notice that all three of these have the same type of function. Chitin is going to be found in fungi as their cell wall. And we also have chitin found in the exoskeleton of crustaceans and insects. And the last one for structure is peptidoglycan. And peptidoglycan is found in the bacteria cell wall. Okay? So there are three types of carbohydrates that are used as structural functions. As we go down the notes, the last little bit, and so today this is going to be really quick. Continuing with the structure and function, the way something is shaped is going to affect the function of it. So just like how we've talked before in Bio 1 about mitochondria.
Members of the track team, please listen up. Your meeting has been moved to outside Coach Bissay's office. You're no longer outside. You're outside of Ms. Bissay's office.
So just like with the mitochondria, how we have all those folds within the mitochondria, within the matrix, and that allows for that increased surface area, which will allow it to increase the production of ATP that it produces. The same thing kind of happens with these sugars, and with the chemical molecules itself. So if you look here, we have two types of carbohydrates, two polysaccharides, starch and cellulose. Notice that in the starch molecule, the direction of the oxygen is the same. And so again, this is that linkage between the glucose molecules. And because all of those linkages are below or in the same direction, so we can say same direction. This is actually called an alpha linkage, or alpha glucose molecule. And then down here, if you notice with the cellulose, we have alternate directions. Which gives us the beta linkage. Okay? the beta glucose molecule. And what that really means and why that matters is that that affects how we can break it down. So with a starch molecule, starch is found in excess in a plant like potatoes. Starch we can break down. So starch can be digested by everyone, or pretty much everyone. Whereas when you have cellulose, that alternating directions of that oxygen molecule and the way in which it bonds with the rest of the carbon chain actually affects the digestion. So for cellulose, it can be only broken down by very few organisms, and an example of that would be like a cow. And that's going to be because our cow has bacteria and protists, and actually has special enzymes that's going to help it digest it and break it down. So this alternating directions of that beta glucose molecule actually allows it to be resistant to metabolic processes like digestion, okay? And so that's all we have today with the carbohydrates. Make sure you answer all of the questions that are going to follow the video, and make sure that you complete your note card.